She left her in the rain, not by accident, not by confusion, by decision. Mary San's mother looked back once through the rear window of a white SUV, saw her daughter sitting in the wheelchair on the wet concrete of a gas station forecourt 40 kilometers outside of Seoul, and told the driver to go. That was a Tuesday morning in late November. The girl was 19 years old. The rain was heavy and cold and indifferent, and no one at the gas station moved for 63 seconds. No one except the man filling a matte black sedan at the adjacent pump, who watched the white SUV disappear into the gray distance and then turned very slowly and looked at the girl in the wheelchair and made a decision of his own. His name was Kang Juno. He was 44 years old. He ran an organization that controlled 6 distinct revenue streams across 3 districts of Seoul, managed 41 people directly and approximately 300 indirectly, and he had not, in 22 years of operating in the spaces between law and legitimacy, been surprised by a human being. He was surprised now. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Mary-san was sitting very straight in her chair. The rain was soaking through her jacket, a thin canvas thing completely unsuited to November. And she was not crying. She was watching the road where the white SUV had gone with an expression Kang Juno would later describe to the only person he described anything to as the face of someone finishing a calculation they had hoped would come out differently. Not grief, not shock, conclusion. He walked across the forecourt. His driver, a man named Woo Song-min, who had been with him for 11 years and had learned to read stillness the way other men read text, stayed beside the car and watched without moving. Kang Juno stopped 2 meters from the girl. He did not crouch down. He did not reach out. He stood in the rain, which was now soaking through his own jacket, a jacket that had cost more than most people in this story would earn in a month, and he said 4 words. Do you need help? She looked at him. She took him in with the careful thoroughness of someone who has learned that reading a person correctly the first time is not a courtesy, but a survival tool. She looked at the car. She looked at Woo Sung-min, who nodded once very slightly from 20 meters away. She looked back at Kang Juno. That depends, she said, on what kind of help. He had not expected that. He had expected fear, or tears, or the flinching compliance of someone in genuine distress, reaching for anything offered. He had not expected a 19-year-old girl, wet through, abandoned on a gas station forecourt by her own family, to respond with a conditional. He thought about it for a moment. The kind, he said, that doesn't obligate you to anything. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, then yes, that exchange, those 7 words from her and 8 from him, was the beginning of something neither of them could have named that morning. Kang Juno did not yet know that the girl in the wheelchair was the reason the next 4 months of his life would cost him more than the previous 22 years combined. And Mary-san did not yet know that the man standing in the rain in the expensive ruined jacket was the first person in her 19 years who would keep every word he said. But the rain was cold and the road was empty, and Woo Seung-min was already moving to open the rear door of the sedan. And so the morning continued. Kang Juno had not arrived at power by being sentimental. He understood that sentiment was expensive and usually inaccurate, a way of weighting decisions with feeling instead of function. He had built what he had built through a series of principles he applied without exception. He did not take on obligations he could not fulfill. He did not make promises in ambiguous language. He did not involve himself in matters that were not his concern, not because he lacked compassion, but because he had learned with precision the cost of diluted focus. He had violated the 3rd principle in 63 seconds on a wet Tuesday in November. He told himself in the car that it was a temporary deviation. He would take the girl somewhere warm and safe. He would make 1 call to a social services contact he maintained for unrelated reasons. He would ensure she was provided for. And then he would return to the 41 direct concerns and the 300 indirect ones and the 6 revenue streams that required his attention. Myra sat in the rear seat beside him and looked out the window at the rain-gray countryside. Rolling past, she did not speak. For 14 minutes, Kang Juno had been in the back of this car with lieutenants who talked too much, with associates who performed composure they did not feel, with one government official who had spoken continuously and desperately for 40 minutes until Kang Juno had asked him, quietly, to stop. He had rarely sat in comfortable silence with anyone. Myra broke it at the 14-minute mark. "You recognized the situation before you came over," she said. "It was not a question. You knew they weren't coming back." "Yes," he said. "How?" He considered the answer honestly. The car didn't slow down when it pulled out. When someone has a moment of doubt about leaving, the car slows. That one didn't. She absorbed this. "So you knew before you asked?" "Yes." She turned and looked at him directly. She had dark eyes and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent long periods in their own company. "Then the question wasn't for information," she said. "It was to give me a starting point." He looked back at her. Yes, she turned back to the window. "That was considerate," she said in a tone that suggested she had filed the observation and moved on, and that she did not give consideration away as currency, but noted it accurately when she encountered it. Kang Juno did not say anything else for a while. He would later note in that single conversational accounting he gave to the only person he talked to fully that the girl had said more true things in 14 minutes of silence and 2 exchanges of speech than most people managed in a year of deliberate communication. He did not yet understand why. He would in time. They arrived at a property he maintained in a residential district south of Mapo, a clean, spare apartment on the 4th floor of a building managed by a woman named Pai Hayeha, who asked no questions as a condition of her employment, but whose judgment Kang Juno trusted completely. Pai Hayeha looked at Myra in the wheelchair, looked at Kang Juno, and said simply, "4th floor has the accessible unit. It's been ready for 2 months." She did not explain why it was ready. She did not need to. She took a key from a numbered board and handed it to Mireille directly. Mireille took it and said, "Thank you." Pai Hayeja said, "The elevator is around the corner. Buzzer 2 if anything's wrong." That was all. In the elevator, Mireille said without looking at him, "She works for you?" "Yes, she gave me the key instead of you." "She makes those decisions herself." Mary was quiet. Then, "Good system." Kang Juno said nothing. But something in the mechanism of his attention, which was a precise and highly developed instrument, shifted very slightly in the direction of the girl beside him. The apartment was clean and warm and had a wide window looking out over a small park. The November trees were bare, and the rain moved through them in gray curtains. Myra wheeled herself to the window and sat there for a moment looking out. Kang Juno stood in the doorway. "I need to make a call," he said, "to a contact who can help with longer-term arrangements. Housing, support services, documentation. You don't have to do that," she said, still facing the window. "I know. Then why are you?" He considered the accurate answer, which was not the comfortable one. "Because what happened this morning was wrong," he said, "and because I was the only one in the vicinity who could do something about it, and because I am going to think about it for a long time if I don't." She turned from the window then and looked at him. The winter light was pale, and even across her face. She was, he noted, not beautiful in the performed way of people who have been told they are beautiful. She was clear. Clarity was the word. Everything about her was clear. Her gaze, her stillness, the undecorated directness of her speech. "Call your contact," she said, "but I want to know what the arrangements are before they're made." "That's a reasonable condition," he said. "It isn't a condition," she said. "It's a requirement." He nodded once. He went into the hallway to make the call. He was away for 11 minutes. When he came back, she was still at the window watching the rain. He told her everything the call had produced, all of it without editing. She listened, asked 4 questions, each of which revealed that she had already mapped the possible complications he had not mentioned, and said she would think about it overnight. He said he would check in tomorrow. She said, "What time?" He said, "When is convenient for you?" She blinked. It was a small motion, almost imperceptible. But Kang Juno, whose professional survival had depended for 22 years on reading small motions, accurately caught it and understood it. She had not been asked that question before, not by the people who should have asked it most. 10 o'clock, she said. In the morning, then I'll come at 10. He left, the door closed. The rain continued against the window. Marie-Son sat in her chair in the warm apartment and looked at the bare trees in the small park below and thought about what it meant that a criminal with 41 direct employees and 6 revenue streams had treated her in the space of 2 hours with more straightforward dignity than her family had managed in 19 years. She was not yet certain what to do with that information, but she filed it with precision, the way she filed everything, and she did not allow herself to feel it fully, not yet, because feeling it fully would have to wait until she had stable ground to stand it on. The ground was not yet stable, but it was firmer than it had been that morning. And morning, she thought, was where you started. Kang Juno kept the 10 o'clock appointment. He was there at 9:58, which Pai Hyaja noted and did not comment on. He brought nothing, no food, no gifts, because he had learned overnight that bringing things to people in dependent situations was a way of performing generosity while quietly reinforcing the dependency, and he did not want to do that. He came with information. The contact had identified 3 viable housing options: 2 support organizations with strong operational records, and a legal advocate who handled family abandonment cases with a specific expertise in the particular complications that arose when the abandoned person was legally an adult. Because Mary was 19, she was by law an adult, which meant what had happened on that forecourt was not technically child abandonment. It was something more ambiguous, something that could be made to disappear more easily. He told her this without softening it. She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "That's why they did it now. I turned 19 in September." He was quiet for a moment. The weight of that calculation, her family's advanced planning of the date, the age, the legal exposure, settled over the room like the cold air pressing against the window. "How long had they been planning it?" he asked. "I think," she said, choosing her words with care, "they stopped planning it as a question and started planning it as a logistics problem about 2 years ago." She paused. "After my 2nd hospitalization." He did not ask about the hospitalization. It was not his information to ask for. She would tell him what she needed him to know when she decided he needed to know it, and he respected that the way he respected every person's sovereign right to their own disclosure. She told him anyway, not everything, enough. Mireille had a degenerative condition that had begun manifesting when she was 14. Progressive. Not fatal at current projections, but irreversible in the mobility it had already taken and uncertain in how much more it would take over time. The medical costs were real and significant. The emotional cost to her family, she said, with the precise flatness of someone who had done the accounting thoroughly, appeared to have exceeded what they were willing to carry. She did not say it bitterly. She said it the way a person states a fact about weather. "There are good support structures available," Kang Juno said. "People in situations similar to yours who navigate independent living successfully." "I know," she said. "I've been researching it for 18 months. Of course she had. Is there anything you need that isn't on the list of what the contact provided?" She thought about it, which meant she had already been thinking about it and was now selecting what to say. "I need a desk," she said. "A proper one, at wheelchair height. The apartment furniture," is standard. He took out his phone and typed a note. And, she said slightly slower, I need to know that the arrangements you're making are not going to require me to owe something I can't calculate in advance. He put the phone down. He looked at her directly. What I do for you, he said, is done. It doesn't accrue. You don't owe me anything now, and you won't owe me anything later. Not service, not loyalty, not information, not gratitude in the transactional sense. I need you to understand that clearly, because the world I operate in runs on those things, and I don't want you to mistake that world's logic for mine when it concerns you. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the silence had texture. Why? She said. It was the simplest possible question. It was also, he understood, the most loaded one, because the whole history of her 19 years was underneath it. Why would anyone do something for you without attaching a cost? He thought about the accurate answer for a moment. Because, he said, you were sitting in the rain and you hadn't done anything to deserve it. That's the whole reason. It doesn't need to be more complicated. She was quiet. Then she said, very softly, only 4 words. That's very plain. Yes, he said, I meant it to be. She nodded, once decisively, and the conversation moved on to logistics, because she was a person who, once she had received a true answer, did not require it to be elaborated into sentiment. The desk arrived 2 days later. Songmin delivered it himself, which had not been Kang Juno's instruction but was Woo Songmin's choice, and he assembled it in 40 minutes without speaking except once, when he asked Mireille whether she wanted the surface at 68 centimeters or 70, and she said 68, and he said it at 68 without comment. When he left, Mireille sat at the desk and looked at the space in front of her, the clean surface at exactly the right height, and she put both hands flat on it for a moment, the way you put your hands on something solid to confirm it's real. She had work to do. She had been doing it already, on a laptop balanced on her knees, and on a phone whose screen she knew by touch in the dark. Now she had a proper surface. Now she could begin in earnest. What Kang Juno did not yet know was that Mireille had been, for the previous 18 months, accumulating something, not rage, not a plan of retaliation, something more methodical and more consequential. She had been building a record. She had time, which people frequently failed to understand, was the primary resource of someone society had decided to set aside. She had a precise and systematic mind. She had access through the particular invisibility that disability conferred, in rooms where power performed, to conversations and documents and behaviors that people did not guard carefully because they did not notice she was listening. And she had noticed over 18 months of careful and systematic attention that her family's financial situation was not simply a matter of medical costs exceeding income. There was something else, something that had been engineered carefully and over time by a man named Son Dae-sik, her mother's brother, who had managed the family's modest holdings, a small commercial property portfolio accumulated by her grandfather, for the past 11 years. Dae-sik had been taking money from those holdings for 9 years. Not dramatically. Not in the sudden, catastrophic way that gets discovered quickly, slowly, carefully. In amounts that look like fees, like reinvestment losses, like maintenance costs, like consultancy payments to companies that Mary had traced over 14 months of patient research to shell entities that resolved through 3 layers of incorporation, back to Dae-sik himself. The total, by her calculation, was 412 million won over 9 years. And the reason the family had looked at their mounting medical bills and their declining assets and decided that Mireille was the problem, the reason they had spent 2 years planning a logistics problem and executed it on a Tuesday morning in November, was in part because Dae-sik had been very carefully, very slowly, ensuring that the numbers they saw pointed toward her costs and away from his extractions. She had known this for 6 months. She had not told anyone. There had been no one to tell who was both trustworthy and capable of acting on the information, and she had not wanted to spend the knowledge on someone who would use it carelessly, because careless use of it would give Desik time to move the money and destroy the trail. She needed someone precise, someone with organizational capability, someone who, critically, had nothing to gain from protecting Desik and no susceptibility to his particular pressure. She had not known 6 months ago who that person would be. She sat at the 68-centimeter desk and looked at the bare trees in the park and thought about a man who had walked through rain toward her without performing heroism, who had given her a starting point instead of a rescue, who had distinguished between his world's transactional logic and his own. She thought for 3 days. On the 4th day, at 10 o'clock in the morning, she called the number he had left. He answered on the 2nd ring. "I have something to tell you," she said. "It's going to take some time, and I need to know before I tell it whether you are someone who can hold information carefully." He said, "Tell me what careful means to you." She said, "It means not acting until we've understood all the pieces. It means not using the information to generate outcomes beyond the specific harm it describes. It means the people who are hurt by this end up with what they're owed and not just what's dramatic." There was a silence on the line, not hesitation. The particular quality of silence that belongs to someone thinking accurately. "Yes," he said, "I can hold it that way." She began to talk. She talked for 2 hours and 17 minutes. She had the documentation. She had the traced structures, the shell companies, the mapped payment flows, the timeline. She had corroborating records she had photographed over months with the careful patience of someone who understood that a single missed document could collapse the whole architecture of proof. She had a copy of her grandfather's original estate valuation, obtained through a contact at the notary office with whom she had spent 3 months building a relationship specifically for this purpose, which established the baseline against which the extractions could be measured. 412 million won. She said it again with the number because the number mattered. The specificity was the point. Kang Juno listened without interrupting, except 3 times, each time to ask a question that showed he had understood exactly what she had said and was tracking the implications forward. When she finished, he said one thing. "You built this alone?" "Yes." "Over 18 months, 14 months of active documentation, 18 of preliminary attention." Another silence. "Who helped you, not whether. Who?" "The notary contact. A university student who owed me a favor and is good at corporate registry research." "Otherwise no one." He said, "Mireille." She said, "Yes." He said, "This is extraordinary work." She did not respond to that immediately, because the word extraordinary, applied to her by most people, would have carried the faint inflection of surprise, the slight emphasis that meant extraordinary for someone like you. He had said it without that inflection. He had said it the way you say it about work. She said, "I need to know what you think the right next step is." He said, "I think the right next step is a lawyer, not my kind. A civil attorney with forensic accounting capability and family law expertise. I know one who is scrupulously legitimate and will take this seriously. I can't pay a retainer. I know that's not the obstacle you think it is. There is a provision in civil estate cases where the damaged party, meaning your grandfather's estate, and its legitimate inheritors, meaning you can pursue on a contingency basis when the fraud is documented to this level. I know this because I encountered a situation 14 years ago on the other side of that law. You won't need a retainer." She filed this. "You said you know the lawyer." "I do." "Does the lawyer know what you are?" "Yes." And the lawyer is still scrupulously legitimate. The lawyer, he said, is scrupulously legitimate specifically because she decided 12 years ago that the most effective way to operate in the spaces between law and the things I do was to be irreproachably clean. She takes cases that most firms won't touch. Because of the surrounding complications, she is very good. Myrae thought about this. The surrounding complication in this case being that the person who found the documentation was brought in by you. Yes, that will need to be disclosed to her accurately. And you think she'll still take it? I think, he said carefully, that she will look at 14 months of meticulous forensic documentation assembled by a 19-year-old who was left in the rain on a Tuesday, and she will take it. Myrae was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Set up the meeting." The lawyer's name was Cha Yeon-soo. She was 51 years old, had practiced for 23 years, and had an office in Seokyo, that was Myrae noted, when she arrived 2 days later, organized with the specific precision of someone who used space to think. No clutter. Every surface with a clear function. The light was good, large windows, no overhead fluorescence, which Myrae appreciated for reasons unrelated to aesthetics. Yeon Yeon-soo did not look at the wheelchair the way most people looked at the wheelchair, which was either too much or too deliberately not at all. She looked at Myrae and then she said, "You've brought documentation." "Yes." "Physical and digital." "Both. Then let's start." They worked for 4 hours. Yeon-soo went through every document Myrae had assembled with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had built cases from financial evidence for 2 decades, and her questions were precise and technical and completely free of the condescension that expertise sometimes generates. When Myrae produced the corporate registry research, Cha Yeon-soo said, "This is clean work." When Myrae explained the methodology she had used to establish the timeline, Cha Yeon-soo made a note and said, "The court will want this methodology explained clearly." "Can you do that?" "Yes," Myrae said, confidently, without hedging. "Yes." Cha Yeon-soo looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said, and moved on. At the end of the 4 hours, Cha Yeon-soo said, "I'll take the case contingency basis as discussed. The documented fraud is sufficient for a civil action, and there may be criminal referral potential depending on how the financial authorities assess the deception element." Myrae said, "The goal is recovery of the assets for the estate, not punishment. Those aren't mutually exclusive. I know I'm telling you where I want the emphasis." Cha Yeon-soo looked at her again. That same particular look, the one that was purely assessment, free of sentiment. "Noted," she said. As Myrae was leaving, Cha Yeon-soo said from behind her desk, "How long have you known Kang Juno?" 11 days, Myrae said. Cha Yeon-soo said nothing for a moment. Then very quietly, almost to herself, he walked through the rain. Myrae stopped her chair. "What?" Cha Yeon-soo looked up. "Something he said to me a long time ago. That the thing about being in this business, meaning his business, is that you learn very quickly who walks through the rain and who waits under the awning. He has very little patience for the people under the awning." She paused. "I've never known him to be the one walking through the rain toward someone else." Myrae thought about that for the length of the elevator ride down. She thought about it in the car. She thought about it later at the 68-centimeter desk, the park outside gray and quiet under the winter sky. She had been for 19 years accustomed to being waited out, to being the inconvenient problem that people stood at a distance from, calculating whether the walk was worth it. She had adapted to this with the particular efficiency of someone who does not have the luxury of collapsing under conditions they cannot change. She had built her own systems. She had built her own knowledge. She had become, in the specific and functional sense, self-sufficient in the interior, even when the exterior world was actively hostile. But she was 19 years old, And for all the precision of her mind and the discipline of her emotional management, she was 19 years old, and she had been left in the rain on a Tuesday, and the cost of that was real, and it sat in her chest like a stone. She had gotten very good at breathing around. She sat at the desk for a while and did not work. She just sat. The park below was empty. The winter light was fading. The stone sat where it always sat. Then she opened her laptop and she worked. Weeks passed. Yansu's office moved through the procedural architecture of a civil fraud case with the methodical pace that legal mechanisms impose, a pace that is frustrating to the impatient and familiar to the precise filings. Notices, responses, and counter-responses. Sun Dae-sik, through his own lawyer, a man whose specialty was delay, denied everything in language so vague it was almost admirable in its emptiness. Kang Juno checked in at 10 o'clock on the mornings when he came, which was 3 times a week, and on the other mornings he sent Woo Seinman with the same consistency and without it being a system that required discussion. He and Myrae talked about the case, about Cha Yin-su's updates, about the procedural obstacles Dae-sik's lawyer was constructing. They talked about other things. Kang Juno's opinion of certain categories of human behavior, Myrae's 18 months of reading across disciplines she had pursued with the systematic hunger of someone educating themselves without an institution, the philosophy of attention, the mechanics of trust. She asked him one morning in December how he thought about the people who worked for him. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think about whether I'm being accurate with them, he said, whether what I tell them matches what I know, whether what I ask them to do is something I'm willing to be accountable for. That's accountability, she said. I asked how you think about them. He was quiet. As people who made a specific choice to operate in a specific way and who do that work with competence and commitment, he said. I don't think about them as instruments. Do you think about them as people you care about? Another quiet moment. Longer this time, some of them, he said. Yes, Woo Seinman, she said. Not a question, yes. Pai Haija, yes, she nodded. Then you're not as armored as you perform to be? He looked at her. I don't think I've been performing armor around you. No, she said. You haven't. I'm noting the discrepancy between what you show the world and what you show here, and what do you make of the discrepancy? She thought about it, genuinely. I think the world version is what you built for survival, and the version here is closer to what was there before the building started. She paused. I think you know the difference. I think most people in your position stop knowing the difference. He was quiet for a long time. The winter light moved through the window. A car passed below on the wet street. Why do you think I still know? He said, not defensively, with genuine curiosity. Because you asked me what time was convenient, she said. People who have lost the difference stop asking that. He said nothing. He looked at the window. The light was pale and even, and the bare trees stood in it with their particular winter clarity. He said, eventually, you pay attention. Yes, she said. It's what I have. It's what I've always had. When everything else got difficult, I still had that, and I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to waste it by pre-deciding what mattered and what didn't. He looked at her then. Something in his expression shifted, barely a fraction of degree. The way a compass needle finds true north after being held near interference for a long time. That, he said quietly, is the most valuable thing a person can decide. She held his gaze. I know, she said simply. And they let the morning sit there clean and cold and honest without adding anything to it. The case moved. Cha Yan-soo, in January, filed for an emergency asset preservation order when her forensic accountant flagged movement in one of D6's shell structures, a transfer of approximately 60 million won toward an account registered in a third-party name that Murray's earlier research had not captured. They got the order within 48 hours. The movement stopped. D6's legal strategy shifted from denial toward minimization. His lawyer's filings began using language like modest administrative irregularities and accounting methodology differences, which Cha Yan-soo documented carefully as the forensic record grew. Kang Juno was, technically, not a party to any of this. He had made no calls to pressure anyone. He had used no leverage. He had not needed to. What he had done was provide structural support, the apartment, the access to Cha Yeon-soo, the desk at 68 centimeters, and the 10 o'clock mornings. And none of those things needed to be mentioned in a courtroom because none of them were the mechanism of the case. The mechanism of the case was 14 months of Mireille-san paying attention. But Dasik knew, or believed, that Kang Juno was somewhere in the surrounding structure. And Dasik was afraid of this, which was understandable given what Kang Juno was, but which was also, in its way, a mistake. Because Dasik assumed that Kang Juno's involvement meant the game had become extra-legal, which made Dasik consider extra-legal responses. And an extra-legal response to Kang Juno's perceived backing was a very different proposition than an extra-legal response to a 19-year-old niece with a wheelchair and a civil case. Kang Juno became aware of this in the second week of February. The awareness came through Woo Seo-min, who had heard a thing from a person who heard things, which was the operational structure through which most of Kang Juno's relevant intelligence moved. What Dasik was considering was not violent. It was bureaucratic in the specific, aggressive sense of someone trying to manufacture complications around a case through connections in the administrative apparatus of the court registry. Kang Juno did not move on this immediately. He thought about it for a day. He thought about what Mireille had said. The goal is recovery, not punishment. He thought about what she had said about holding information carefully, about not generating outcomes beyond what the specific harm described. He thought about what she had said about acting only after understanding all the pieces. He called Cha Yan-soo. There may be pressure coming, he said. Through registry administration, I don't have details. I want you to be aware. Cha Yan-soo said, This happens. I know how to document it when it does. I know. I wanted you to have the lead time noted, she said. Anything else? No, he said, that's all. He called Miri after. I want to tell you something, he said. Tell me. He told her about D6's potential move, all of it, without editing for her comfort. Because she had asked him once to be someone who held information carefully, and careful did not mean withheld. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, Is more afraid than I expected. Fear makes people reach for things they shouldn't. Can he damage the case? Cha Yan-soo says she can document any interference. Documentation of obstruction attempt can strengthen the fraud case. Another quiet moment. So his fear is actually working against him. Yes, she said, I want to understand something. What are you doing right now? In terms of your own involvement. I made one call to Cha Yan-soo to give her lead time. That's the entirety of what I'm doing. Why no more than that? Because the case is yours, the work is yours, the legal mechanism is legitimate and functional, and Cha Yan-soo is excellent. My intervening beyond information transfer would be adding weight to a structure that is already sound and would compromise the integrity of what you built. She said very quietly, You understand that most people in your position would not make that distinction. I know, he said. Why do you? He thought about the honest answer. Because you told me what careful meant, he said, and you were right, and I decided to hold it the way you described. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, Okay, just that. Okay. But in the particular way she used plain language, it carried the weight of something much larger. March came. The civil case hearing was scheduled for the third week of the month. Ka Yeon-soo had built a presentation of evidence that was, in her own assessment, the cleanest fraud documentation she had handled in 23 years. And this was, she noted to Kang Juno in one of the 3 conversations they had during the case. Not because the fraud was simple, but because the person who had assembled the documentation had done so with an almost formal rigor. The night before the hearing, Myrae sat at her desk and looked at the park. The trees were just beginning to show the first faint green of early spring, a barely visible softening along the branches, the kind that you miss if you're not paying attention. She was paying attention. She thought about her family. Her mother, who had looked back once through the rear window and told the driver to go. Her father, who had been in the passenger seat and had not looked back at all. The 2 younger siblings, who had been asleep in the back seat or performing sleep, she would never know which. She thought about these people with the precision she applied to everything, without the insulation of judgment, just the clear accounting of what had happened and what it meant. They had done something that could not be undone. Not fixed, not apologized away. The thing they had done was the thing they had done, and it sat in the record of her life as permanently as any other fact. And she had decided, somewhere in the weeks since the clean apartment and the 68-centimeter desk and the 10 o'clock mornings, that the permanence of a wound did not obligate her to make it the organizing principle of her existence. It was not forgiveness. It was something more functional and less sentimental than forgiveness. It was the decision that her life had to be organized around what she was building, not around what had been done to her. Because what had been done to her was finished, and what she was building was ongoing. She opened her laptop, she worked until midnight, then she closed it, and she slept. The hearing lasted 2 days. Yeon-soo's presentation of evidence was exactly as clean as the documentation behind it. Dae-sik's lawyer's minimization strategy collapsed on the second day when Cha Yeon-soo introduced the corporate registry trace that connected 3 of the shell entities directly to Dae-sik through a directorial appointment that he had apparently forgotten he had signed a document that Myrae had found in a secondary registry database that most researchers did not know to check. The court ordered a full forensic audit of the estate holdings. The asset preservation order was made permanent pending the audit. Dae-sik left the courtroom looking like a man who had finally understood what he had been dealing with. Not Kang Juno's organization, not any external threat, but a 19-year-old who had sat for 14 months at a phone and a laptop balanced on her knees in a borrowed desk and just paid attention. The audit took 6 weeks. The recovery order, issued in May, confirmed 418 million won in fraudulent extractions, 6 million more than Myrae's estimate, accounting for a final movement she had not captured. The funds were to be restored to the estate. Criminal referral was filed. Cha Yeon-soo called Myrae the morning the order came through. She said, "The number is 418 million. You were 4.7% below." Myrae said, "I didn't have visibility into the last movement." Cha Yeon-soo said, "No, you had visibility into every other movement across 9 years." A pause. "Congratulations," Cha Yeon-soo said, "not on the recovery, on the work." Myrae said, "Thank you." She ended the call and sat very still in her chair for a moment. The May light was warm through the window. The park below was green now, the trees fully leaved, the morning bright and unhurried. She called Kang Juno. He answered on the second ring as he always did. "It's done," she said. "I know," he said. "Cha called me 10 minutes ago. She wasn't supposed to." "No," he agreed. "She did it anyway." A pause. "She said it was the cleanest forensic case she's handled. She told me that too. How are you?" She thought about that. The real question underneath the question, which was how are you in the sense of what does it feel like, To have done this, to have sat alone with this for 14 months and then 6 more months with a growing circle of careful people, and to have brought it through to where it needed to go. "I'm good," she said, and then, because she had decided against adding decoration to what was already plain, "I'm genuinely good." He said, "I'm glad." A moment of quiet between them. Then she said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "When you came across the forecourt in November, the 63 seconds before you moved, what were you actually deciding?" He was quiet. It was the genuine kind, the kind that meant he was taking the question seriously enough to answer it accurately. "I was deciding," he said slowly, "whether I was the kind of person who walks through rain toward someone. I knew I could be. I wasn't certain I still was." She was quiet for a moment. "And," she said, "and I decided I was, and then I walked," she said. "I'm glad you hadn't lost the difference," he said. "So am I." The spring morning sat around the apartment, clean and warm. Below, the park was green and alive. The desk was exactly 68 centimeters high. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday, with no awareness of what had been built in this quiet room over 6 months by a girl with a wheelchair and a precise mind, and the decision made a long time ago to pay absolute attention to everything. Kang Juno came at 10 o'clock that morning. As he had come 3 times a week since December, he brought nothing. He sat in the chair across from the desk. They talked about what came next, not in the abstract, but concretely. The estate recovery, the process by which Mireille would establish independent management of her portion of the inherited assets, the medical support structure she had already researched and would now have the resource to access, the practical forward steps of a life being built on firmer ground. At some point in the middle of the conversation, without planning it, King Juno said, "You're going to be fine." Mireille looked at him. "I know," she said. "I mean in the larger sense." "I know what you mean," she paused. "I've always known. It just took a while to have the ground for it." He nodded. He looked at the window, at the green trees, at the warm May light over the small park. "There's a thing I want to say," he said. "Say it." "What happened in November," he said. "What your family did. I want to say clearly for the record between us that it was wrong. Not complicated, not contextually ambiguous. Wrong. And the fact that you have handled it with the intelligence and discipline you've shown does not retroactively make it less wrong. It is still wrong, and it will remain wrong." She was very still. The morning light was on her face, and she let it sit there without moving away from it. "I know," she said quietly. "I wanted to name it," he said, "out loud, because sometimes things need to be named." She said yes, and then after a moment, "Thank you," just those 2 words. But in the plainness of them, in the clarity she always brought to plain language, they carried the full weight of what she meant. Thank you for naming it. Thank you for treating it as a fact rather than a wound to be managed. Thank you for being someone who understood that the naming of a true thing is itself a form of care. Kang Juno was 44 years old and had built an organization across 3 districts of Seoul and had 22 years of operating in the spaces between law and legitimacy, and he had not in any of those years felt the particular quality of being accurately seen that he felt in this room at 10 o'clock in the morning by a 19-year-old who had decided a long time ago not to waste her attention by pre-deciding what mattered. He had come across a gas station forecourt 63 seconds after a white SUV drove away, and he had asked a girl in the rain 4 words, and the girl had answered with a conditional. And the conditional was the beginning of something that had no clean category in the vocabulary he had used to organize his life until that Tuesday. It was not sentiment, it was not debt, it was not obligation, it was something built on plain statements and kept appointments and 68-centimeter desks and questions about convenient times. Built on, holding information carefully and not generating outcomes beyond what the harm described. Built on two people who had each, in their own way and for their own reasons, decided that the difference between performing a thing and actually being a thing was worth the cost of knowing which was which. Attention, she had said. It's what I have, it's what I've always had. It was, he now understood, the most accurate description of the rarest quality he had ever encountered. The park was green, the morning was warm. The world outside was moving through its ordinary Tuesday. And inside the clean apartment on the 4th floor, at the desk that was exactly the right height, in the spring light coming through the wide window, two people were paying attention. To the conversation, to the forward steps, to the warm and ordinary morning, to the particular truth that some things are not repaired, but built new, and that new is not lesser, but different. And that different, when it is built on ground that is actually firm, is sometimes quietly better than what was before. Attention is not the thing you give when everything else is in order. Attention is the order itself. The morning held, the trees were green, the ground was firm, and that, finally, was enough.